Sometimes, the people who shaped our childhood hearts find their way back to us when we least expect it. For mountain man Silas McGraw, 15 years of wilderness solitude couldn't prepare him for the moment his past came knocking. One evening, a beautiful woman in a torn wedding dress appears at his remote cabin door. She claims to be little Clara Whitmore, the girl who used to follow him through the woods back home. Silas can barely recognize this refined lady as his childhood friend. Clara has traveled hundreds of dangerous miles to find him, running from an arranged marriage she couldn't face. She carries secrets that could change everything between them, but why would she risk her life to seek out a gruff mountain man she hasn't seen since they were children? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of snow down from the high peaks. As Silas McGraw set his coffee cup on the rough-hewn table and studied the woman sleeping by his fireplace. In the flickering light, wrapped in his old wool blanket, she looked nothing like the dirt-smudged child he remembered from Millfield Valley. Yet something in the delicate curve of her chin, the way her dark lashes rested against pale cheeks, stirred memories he'd buried deep as winter frost. Clara Whitmore. Little Clara, who used to trail behind him and his older brother Tom through the woods, always asking questions, always wanting to help with whatever mischief boys could devise. She couldn't have been more than 10 when the McGraw family packed their wagon and headed west, leaving behind the green valley that had been home for 3 generations. Silas was 15 then, tall for his age and already restless, eager to see what lay beyond the familiar hills. Now, 23 years later, she'd found him in this remote cabin nestled in a grove of ancient pines, miles from the nearest settlement. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd spent 15 years avoiding human contact had his solitude shattered by a ghost from his childhood. He rose quietly and walked to the single window, gazing out at the moonlit clearing where he'd built his life one log at a time. The cabin was modest but solid, with thick walls to keep out the mountain cold and a stone chimney that drew well. Shelves lined one wall, holding his few books, ammunition, and the tools of his trade. Beaver pelts hung drying from the rafters, and his rifles stood ready in the corner. It was a life pared down to essentials, free from the complications that came with other people, or it had been, until she arrived. Silas remembered the exact moment he'd opened the door 3 hours earlier. The woman standing on his threshold had been a vision from another world. Silk and satin torn and muddied, dark hair escaping from what had once been an elegant arrangement. Brown eyes wide with exhaustion and something close to desperation. She'd swayed on her feet, and he'd caught her arm instinctively. "Please," she'd whispered, her voice cultured and soft despite her obvious distress. "I need your help. I'm Clara Whitmore from Millfield Valley. Don't you remember me?" For a long moment, he'd simply stared. The name meant something, tugged at memories like smoke, but this refined lady bore no resemblance to the little girl with pigtails and freckles who used to dare him to climb higher trees and cross deeper streams. "I know you don't recognize me," she'd continued, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "But you're Silas McGraw, aren't you? You lived in the big white house on Elm Street with the apple orchard out back. Your mother made the best molasses cookies in the valley, and your father carved wooden toys for all the children at Christmas." The details had hit him like a physical blow. No one in these mountains knew those things about his family, about the life he'd left behind. He'd stepped back, gesturing her inside, and watched as she'd collapsed into the chair by his fire, her elaborate wedding dress puddling around her like spilled cream. A wedding dress. That detail had registered slowly, along with the gold band, gleaming on her left hand and the bruise darkening along her jaw. "What happened to you?" he'd asked, the words rough from disuse. He spoke little these days, mainly to his horses and the occasional trapper who stopped by to trade. She'd looked up at him with those familiar brown eyes, and suddenly He could see her as she'd been, the earnest little girl who'd followed him. Everywhere, hanging on his every word, like he held the secrets of the universe. "I ran away," she'd said simply. "On my wedding day, I couldn't go through with it." Then she'd pulled something from the bodice of her dress, a small wooden bear carved from pine and polished smooth by years of handling. He'd recognized it immediately, though he hadn't thought of it in decades. "You gave this to me the day before your family left," she'd whispered, holding it out to him. "I was crying because I knew I'd never see you again. You said to keep it safe, and when I grew up, you'd come back for it." The memory had flooded back then, sharp and clear as mountain water. He'd been helping his father load the wagon when he'd heard sobbing from behind the barn. Little Clara had been sitting in the dirt, her dress torn from crawling under the fence, tears making muddy tracks down her cheeks. He'd carved that bear just the night before, whittling away his own sadness. At leaving, and on impulse, he'd pressed it into her small hands. "For luck," he'd told her then, "so you won't forget me." "I never forgot," she'd said now, pressing the wooden bear back into his calloused palm. "I kept it all these years, through everything, and when I needed to disappear, to find someone I could trust completely, I thought of you." That had been 3 hours ago. Since then, she'd eaten the simple stew he'd heated and fallen asleep by the fire, exhausted by whatever ordeal had brought her to his door. He'd covered her with his warmest blanket and settled into his chair to keep watch, studying her face in the firelight and marveling at the strange turns life could take. The little wooden bear sat on the table beside his coffee, somehow smaller than he'd remembered, but perfectly crafted. His father had taught him to carve when he was just 7 years old, patient hands guiding his small fingers as they learned to read the grain of the wood, to coax figures from blocks of pine and oak. It had been one of the few gentle memories from his childhood, those quiet evenings when his father set aside the day's work to teach his sons the old skills. Tom had never taken to it, preferring the more active pursuits of hunting and riding. But Silas had found peace in the slow, careful work of shaping wood, in the way a piece of birch or maple would reveal its secrets under his knife. He'd carved dozens of small animals over the years, giving them away to younger children or leaving them on windowsills for mothers to find. The bear had been special, though, carved with extra care because he'd known it would be his last gift to the valley, his way of saying goodbye to the only home he'd ever known. Now, Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something too soft to catch. In repose, her face held traces of the girl he'd known. But 15 years had refined her features, adding grace to what had been mere promise. Her hands, folded beneath her cheek, were soft and well cared for, speaking of a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier existence. Yet she'd traveled hundreds of miles through dangerous country to find him, guided by nothing more than childhood memory and desperate hope. The questions multiplied in his mind like shadows cast by the dying fire. How had she found him? What was she running from that marriage couldn't solve? And most troubling of all, why did the sight of her sleeping in his cabin feel so natural, as if she belonged there among his simple possessions? He'd built this life deliberately, carefully, like the cabin itself, one log at a time, fitted and chinked against the storms. After the war, after watching too many good men die for causes they barely understood, he'd craved only silence and solitude. The mountains had offered both, along with clean air and the honest work of surviving by his own skill and strength. Women had been part of the life he'd left behind, along with society's expectations and the weight of other people's needs. Not that he'd sworn them off entirely. He was human, after all, and the occasional trip to trading posts had provided companionship when the isolation grew too heavy. But he'd never brought anyone here, never shared this sanctuary he'd carved from the wilderness. Yet here she was, and despite every rational argument his mind could muster, he felt no desire to send her away. Perhaps it was the connection to his past, the sweet ache of remembering simpler times when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of disappointment. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in deeper shadows. Silas added another log, stirring the coals until flames licked up around the seasoned oak. Clara didn't wake, but she shifted slightly, the blanket slipping to reveal the torn lace of her wedding dress. The sight stirred an unexpected anger. In him, what manner of man had she been forced to marry that she'd chosen the wilderness over his protection? Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, no matter how much the idea appealed to some long-buried part of his heart. Whoever she'd run from would likely come looking, and his cabin, remote as it was, wouldn't remain hidden forever. He'd need to hear her full story, understand exactly what kind of trouble had followed her into his mountains. But tonight, she was safe. Tonight, the wind could howl around the cabin walls and the temperature could drop toward freezing. But Clara Whitmore, the little girl who'd kept his wooden bear for 15 years, slept peacefully by his fire. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that felt like enough. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains, with frost painting the cabin windows in delicate patterns. Clara woke slowly, consciousness returning in gentle waves as she became aware of unfamiliar surroundings. Rough log walls, the lingering scent of wood smoke, and a profound quiet that spoke of vast distances from civilization. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd arrived. Then memory crashed back like a physical blow, and she sat up abruptly, her heart racing. "Easy now," came a deep voice from across the room. Silas stood at the stove, stirring something. In a cast-iron pot, his movements careful and economical. "You're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign after the terror of yesterday, the desperate flight through darkness with the sound of pursuing horses echoing behind her. She touched her jaw where Cornelius Blackwood's ring had struck her, feeling the tender bruise that served as a reminder of how close she'd come to a life of misery. "I need to tell you everything," she said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. "About why I came here. About what I'm running from." Silas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to her, settling into his chair with the patient stillness she remembered from their childhood. He'd always been a good listener, even as a boy, willing to hear out her endless chatter about books and dreams and the wide world beyond Millfield Valley. "Start wherever feels right," he said simply. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup, gathering her courage. "His name is Cornelius Blackwood. He owns half the businesses in Millfield now, and he's been buying up land throughout the valley. When my father died last spring, our farm was heavily in debt. Mr. Blackwood offered to settle everything if I'd agree to marry him." The words tasted bitter, but she forced herself to continue. "I thought I could bear it. I thought marriage to a wealthy man would at least secure my future, even if it couldn't bring happiness. But on our wedding day, I overheard him talking to his associates about his plans for me." She shuddered, remembering Blackwood's cold laughter, as he described her as a pretty ornament to legitimize his business dealings. But worse had been his casual mention of expanding his operations into the territory, using methods that skirted the edges of the law. "He struck you," Silas observed quietly, his green eyes noting the bruise on her face. "When I tried to back out of the ceremony, he said I belonged to him now, that I'd signed papers making him my guardian as well as my intended husband. I'd been so desperate to save the farm that I hadn't read the documents carefully." Clara's voice broke slightly. "I realized then that I'd traded away more than my hand in marriage. I'd signed away my freedom entirely." Silas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, but she caught the tightening around his eyes. "So you ran." "I waited until the reception began, then slipped out through the kitchen. I'd hidden riding clothes in the barn earlier, just in case. I knew he'd send men after me, so I headed for the mountains. I remembered your father talking about the routes west, about the high passes that led to the remote valleys." She looked around the cabin, still marveling that she'd actually found him. I followed deer trails and old Indian paths, staying off the main roads. It took me 4 days. 4 days alone in the wilderness. There was something like admiration in his voice, mixed with concern. You could have died out there, Clara. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. I know, but staying would have been a different kind of death. She pulled the gold wedding ring from her finger, staring at the heavy band that had felt like a shackle. I put this on in the church, but I couldn't go through with speaking the vows. I couldn't promise to love and honor a man who saw me as property. Silas reached across the table and took the ring from her trembling fingers, examining it in the morning light. It was gaudy and expensive, the kind of display piece a man like Blackwood would choose to show his wealth and status. Without a word, Silas walked to the fireplace and tossed the ring into the flames. Your past life ends here, he said firmly. Whatever papers you signed, whatever promises were made, they don't follow you into these mountains. Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. After days of fear and uncertainty, his simple acceptance felt like a benediction. But he won't give up easily. Blackwood doesn't like to lose, and he's got men who'll do whatever he asks for the right price. Let them come. There was steel in Silas's voice now, and she caught a glimpse of the man he'd become during their years apart. Harder than the boy she'd known, tempered by experiences she could only imagine. These mountains have swallowed up plenty of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. She studied his face, seeing new lines around his eyes and a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there in their youth. What happened to you after you left the valley? Where have you been all these years? His expression shuttered slightly, the way it had when he'd been a boy and someone asked about his father's drinking or his mother's long silences. Different places. I spent time in California during the gold rush, then drifted north. Did some scouting for wagon trains, some trading with the tribes. Eventually found my way here and decided to stay. It was an abbreviated version, she could tell. The scars on his hands spoke of hard labor, and there was a wariness in his eyes that suggested he'd seen violence. But she didn't press. They both carried secrets from their years apart, wounds that might heal better in their own time. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for me, she said finally. I just needed somewhere safe to rest and think about what to do next. And where would you go? The question was gentle but pointed. Back east to relatives who might not take you in? West to territories where a woman alone faces different dangers. She didn't have an answer because there wasn't a good one. Her parents were dead, her few remaining relatives scattered or untrustworthy. The skills that had made her a suitable wife for a wealthy man, playing piano, speaking French, managing a household, were useless for surviving on her own in the wilderness. You could stay here, Silas said quietly, at least until spring. These mountains are hard to navigate in winter, and anyone tracking you would have to wait for the passes to clear. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Staying meant months alone, together in this remote cabin, sharing space and daily routines, in a way that would have been scandalous in polite society. But polite society had been willing to sell her to the highest bidder, so perhaps its opinions mattered less than she'd once believed. I won't be a burden, she said finally. I can cook and clean, tend a garden if you have one. I'm stronger. Then I look, and I learn quickly. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his weathered features. I remember. You always were determined to prove you could keep up with the older children. And I usually could, she replied, feeling a spark of her old spirit returning. This time he did smile, and for a moment she saw the boy he'd been. Kind, patient, protective of those smaller and weaker than himself. But he was a man now, broad-shouldered and capable, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much of the world's harsh realities. All right then, he said, rising to refill their coffee cups. We'll see how you take to mountain living. But Clara, he turned back to face her, his expression serious. If Blackwood's men do find this place, there might come a time when running isn't enough. Are you prepared for that? She met his gaze steadily, thinking of the fear in Blackwood's eyes when she'd refused him, of the cold calculation in his voice when he'd spoken of her as his property. "I won't go back to him, whatever it takes." He nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied something he'd needed to know. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls and reminding them both of the vast wilderness that surrounded their small sanctuary. Somewhere out there, men might already be searching for her, following her trail toward this hidden valley. But for now, she was safe, protected by these mountains and by the man who'd once been the kindest boy she'd ever known. The gold ring hissed and melted in the flames, its destruction marking the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. The next few days fell into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its natural ease. She woke each morning to the sound of Silas building up the fire, the cabin already warm by the time she emerged from beneath the heavy quilts he'd given her. He would have coffee ready and simple breakfast prepared, usually cornbread or biscuits with honey, sometimes eggs from the small flock of chickens he kept in a coop behind the cabin. "Never thought I'd see the day when Clara Whitmore would be grateful for such plain fare," he teased gently on the third morning, watching her eat with obvious appetite. Clara Whitmore learned to appreciate many things she'd taken for granted. She replied, surprised by how easily their old familiarity was returning. "Besides, you always could make the best flapjacks in 3 counties." It wasn't entirely true. His cooking was functional rather than inspired. But the appreciation in his eyes made the small lie worthwhile. He'd grown unused to compliments, she realized, after years of solitary living. After breakfast, Silas would check his trap lines, or tend to necessary maintenance around the cabin while Clara tackled the domestic tasks. She'd expected these to come naturally, given her upbringing. But mountain living presented unique challenges. Water had to be hauled from the creek and heated over the fire for washing. Laundry required planning and considerable physical effort. Even simple cooking became complicated when every ingredient had to be carefully rationed and preserved for the long winter ahead. Her first attempt at bread proved to be an embarrassing disaster, the loaves emerging from the Dutch oven as dense as rocks and nearly as inedible. Silas had taken a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and observed, "Well, we won't need to worry about ammunition if anyone tries to attack the cabin." She'd thrown a dish towel at him, but his gentle humor had taken the sting out of her failure. The next day he'd patiently guided her through the process again, his large hands covering hers as he showed her how to knead the dough properly. "It's about feeling the texture," he'd explained, his voice low and careful. "The dough will tell you when it's ready, smooth and elastic, with just a little give under your fingers." The intimacy of the moment had caught them both off guard. Standing so close, his chest pressed against her back as he guided her movements. Clara had become acutely aware of his strength and warmth. When he'd stepped away abruptly, color rising in his cheeks, she'd felt an odd sense of loss. But such moments were balanced by practical lessons that proved her determination to adapt. Silas had spread his hand-drawn maps across the rough table, one evening showing her the network of trails and landmarks that surrounded their valley. The maps were works of art in themselves, detailed and precise, marking everything from seasonal water sources to dangerous drop-offs. "This is your escape route," he'd said, tracing a path with his finger. "If trouble comes and I'm not here, you follow Willow Creek upstream to this bend, then take the deer trail up the north slope. It's steep, but it leads to another valley, where my friend Jake Thornton has a cabin. He'd help you get to Fort Collins if needed." Clara had memorized the route, understanding the gravity behind his instruction. These weren't idle preparations. They were survival plans, born from real experience of how quickly safety could turn to danger in the wilderness. Her riding skills, rusty from years of ladylike side-saddle lessons, improved rapidly under Silas's patient instruction. He'd fashioned her a split skirt from some of his spare clothing, practical if not fashionable, and spent hours helping her regain confidence in the saddle. His mare, Rosie, was a gentle chestnut with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament that Proved perfect for rebuilding Clara's nerve. She's got good sense, Silas had explained, adjusting Clara's stirrups. She'll keep you out of trouble if you listen to what she's telling you through the reins. Clara found herself enjoying these lessons more than she'd expected. There was freedom in sitting astride a horse, feeling the animal's power beneath her and knowing she could control it. It was so different from the restrictive side-saddle riding of her refined upbringing, where the goal had been to look elegant rather than to actually ride well. One afternoon, while Silas was checking snares in the higher meadows, Clara had ventured to the creek alone to wash their few dishes. The autumn air was crisp and clean, filled with the sound of rushing water and the rustle of golden aspen leaves. She was enjoying the solitude, thinking how different this peaceful moment was from the constant social obligations of her former life. When she heard horses approaching, her blood turned to ice. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, she crept behind a large boulder and peered through the trees toward the main trail. 3 riders were making their way up the valley, moving slowly as if searching for something. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead horse, a black stallion that belonged to Marcus Thorne, one of Blackwood's most trusted men. They'd found her. Clara forced herself to remain still, heart hammering as the riders drew closer. They paused near the creek, one of them dismounting to examine the ground where she and Silas had walked that morning. The tracker pointed toward the cabin, hidden among the pines, and said something she couldn't hear, but their intent was clear. Enough! She waited until they moved on, following the trail deeper into the valley before slipping back to the cabin. Her hands shook as she gathered the few possessions she'd accumulated: spare clothes, her mother's Bible, the wooden bear that had brought her here. If they had to run, she wanted to be ready. When Silas returned an hour later, she was pacing the cabin like a caged animal, starting at every sound from the forest. "They're here," she said without preamble. 3 of Blackwood's men, maybe more. I saw them from the creek." His expression went hard and focused, the easy familiarity of their domestic routine disappearing in an instant. This was the man who'd survived alone in hostile territory, she realized. Alert, dangerous when threatened. How long ago? An hour? Maybe less. They were following our tracks toward the upper valley. Silas moved to the window, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. They'll be back when they realize the trail goes cold up there. We need to decide, run or make a stand. "I won't run anymore," Clara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting Blackwood dictate my choices." He studied her face, perhaps seeing something new there, a resolve that hadn't existed when she'd first arrived at his door. "Fighting means killing, Clara. These aren't gentlemen who'll be discouraged by harsh words. Are you prepared for that?" She thought of Blackwood's cold smile, of the legal documents that had made her his property, of the life of quiet desperation that awaited her if she returned. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Silas nodded slowly, and she saw approval in his green eyes. "Then we'd better get ready. They'll likely wait until dark to approach the cabin, thinking they'll catch us sleeping." As he began checking his rifles and counting ammunition, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. The decision was made, the course set. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside the man who'd once carved her a wooden bear and promised she wouldn't be forgotten. The confrontation Clara had braced for never came. The riders had apparently concluded that the tracks led nowhere and departed before sunset, leaving only hoofprints and broken branches as evidence of their presence. But the incident had changed something fundamental between her and Silas, stripping away the last pretense that this was a temporary arrangement between old friends. That evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning his rifles, Clara had finally told him the complete truth about her family's destruction. Her father hadn't simply fallen into debt. Blackwood had orchestrated his ruin systematically, buying up the notes on their farm, manipulating prices at the grain exchange, even bribing the bank to call in loans early. "He wanted our land specifically," she explained, her fingers tracing the delicate silver chain of the locket that held her parents' portrait. "We owned the best water rights in the valley, and our property connected two of his larger holdings. Papa tried to fight him in court, but Blackwood owned the judge." Silas had listened in grim silence, his hands never pausing in their methodical work of cleaning and oiling the rifle mechanisms. When she finished, he'd looked up with eyes that held a cold anger she'd never seen before. "Men like that don't stop," he'd said quietly. "They take and take until someone makes them stop. I know. That's why I can't go back. And why running won't be enough forever." The implications hung between them, unspoken but understood. Blackwood would keep searching, keep sending men, until he'd exhausted every possibility or found what he sought. Her only real safety lay in removing the threat entirely, a thought that should have horrified her genteel sensibilities, but instead felt like simple logic. The next morning brought the first real snow of the season, fat flakes drifting down from a pewter sky to dust the cabin roof and surrounding pines. Clara woke to find Silas already dressed and preparing for what he called his winter rounds. Checking on the animals, securing loose items, and ensuring their supplies were properly stored. "Storm's coming," he announced, nodding toward the darkening clouds. "We'll likely be snowed in for a week or more. Good thing those riders moved on when they did." Clara had dressed quickly and joined him outside, marveling at how the familiar landscape transformed under its white covering. Everything looked clean and new, as if the world had been given a fresh start. She found herself thinking it was an appropriate metaphor for her own situation. Working together, they'd spent the day preparing for the storm. Clara learned to bank the fire properly for overnight burning, to wrap the water pipes with rags to prevent freezing, and to check that the chicken coop was secure against the wind. Her hands grew numb, despite the thick gloves Silas had given her, but she persisted, determined to prove her usefulness. "You're doing well," he'd observed as they finished securing the last of the shutters. "Most folks from town would be complaining about the cold by now." "Most folks from town haven't spent 4 days sleeping on the ground and eating berries," she'd replied, then paused, struck by a sudden realization. "I'm not the same person who left Millfield, am I?" He'd studied her face, taking in the color. The cold had brought to her cheeks and the confident way she now moved around his cabin. "No," he'd agreed, "you're not." That evening, trapped inside by the howling wind and driving snow, they'd fallen into easy conversation about their childhood memories. Clara had pulled out her mother's Bible, reading aloud by firelight while Silas worked on a new carving, a small deer that was taking shape under his skilled knife. "Remember when we got lost in Hartwell Woods that summer?" she'd asked, pausing in her reading of Psalms. "We must have wandered for hours before we found the creek that led home. You cried for the first 10 minutes, then got mad and said you were going to find the way out yourself," he'd recalled with a slight smile. "Marched off through the trees like you owned the whole forest. And you followed me, even though you knew I was going the wrong direction. I figured we'd get unlost together, or stay lost together. Either way seemed better than splitting up." The words carried weight beyond their childhood context, and Clara had felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The way he looked at her in the lamplight, gentle but intent, familiar yet somehow new, made her pulse quicken. As the days of their enforced isolation stretched on, she'd become increasingly aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with childhood friendship. The way his shoulders moved under his wool shirt when he split kindling, the careful precision of his hands as he carved or cooked or cleaned his weapons, the low rumble of his voice when he spoke, roughened by years of sparse use but warm with genuine kindness. She'd catch herself watching him sometimes, wondering what it would feel like to touch the scar along his jaw or smooth back the dark hair that fell across his forehead when he concentrated on detailed work. The thoughts were scandalous by every standard of her upbringing, but out here in the wilderness, the rules of proper society seemed as distant as the stars. For his part, Silas seemed equally affected by their proximity. She'd noticed the way, His eyes lingered on her face when she laughed, or how he'd step closer than necessary when helping her with some task, his presence both comforting and unsettling. There were moments, reaching for the same dish, passing each other in the cabin's narrow space, when the air between them seemed charged with possibility. On the fourth day of the storm, Clara had been attempting to repair a tear in her riding skirt when the needle slipped and pricked her finger deeply. She'd cried out in surprise and pain, and Silas had been beside her in an instant, taking her injured hand in both of his to examine the wound. "It's not serious," he'd said, but he didn't release her hand. Instead, he'd reached for a clean cloth to press against the bleeding, his touch gentle and sure. "Hold this here while I get some salve." But when he'd returned with the small tin of healing ointment, neither of them had moved. Clara's hand remained in his, her pulse visible at her wrist, and she could feel the warmth of his breath against her hair. Time had seemed suspended, the storm outside forgotten, the world narrowed. To the space between them, "Clara," he'd said softly, and she'd heard a question in her name. She'd looked up to meet his eyes, seeing her own confused longing reflected there. For a moment that felt like eternity. She'd thought he might kiss her. More than thought, hoped. With an intensity that surprised her. Then the wind had rattled the shutters particularly violently, breaking the spell. Silas had stepped back, cleared his throat, and applied the salve to her finger with professional detachment. But she'd seen the slight tremor in his hands, and known that he'd felt it too, this growing attraction that complicated everything. They'd established about their arrangement. That night, lying wakeful in her blankets by the dying fire, Clara had finally admitted to herself what she'd been trying to ignore. She wasn't just grateful to Silas for his protection or merely nostalgic for their childhood friendship. She was falling in love with him, with the man he'd become and the life they were building together in this remote sanctuary. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The storm broke on the fifth day, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of pristine snow. Clara woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the sound of Silas already moving about outside, clearing paths to the barn and chicken coop. She dressed quickly and joined him, gasping at the sharp bite of the morning air and the way the snow sparkled like scattered diamonds across the clearing. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Silas paused in his shoveling to study her face, noting the wonder in her expression. "I never get tired of the first big snow of the season. It's like the whole world has been made new," she agreed, then laughed as she took a step and sank knee-deep into a drift, though I suspect the beauty comes with its own challenges. He'd helped her navigate to the barn, where his 2 horses nickered a greeting and the chickens complained loudly about the cold. While Silas tended the animals, Clara had marveled at his efficiency, every movement purposeful, every task completed with the minimum necessary effort. This was survival distilled to its essence, she realized. No wasted motion, no unnecessary complications. "We need to talk about supplies," he'd said over breakfast, spreading his carefully maintained inventory list on the table. "With 2 of us here for the winter, we'll need to be more careful with rationing." Clara studied the neat columns of numbers, seeing how precisely he'd calculated their needs. Flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, everything measured against the long months until spring. "What can I do to help? Are there things I could gather or preserve?" "Some, yes. There's a stand of pine near the upper meadow where we can collect nuts. Rose hips from the wild bushes make good tea and help prevent scurvy. And if you're willing to learn, there's hunting." The suggestion had surprised her until she remembered his father's rifle, the family heirloom he'd shown her with obvious pride. The weapon was beautifully crafted, its stock worn smooth by generations of handling, and she'd found herself curious about the skill required to use it effectively. Their first hunting lesson had been a disaster. Clara's unfamiliarity with firearms, combined with her tendency to flinch at the rifle's report, resulted in missed shots that sent game scattering across the meadow. But Silas had been patient, adjusting her stance and grip, teaching her to breathe properly and squeeze the trigger smoothly. "Don't fight the weapon," he'd advised, standing behind her to guide the rifle's position. Let it be an extension of yourself. Feel how it wants to move and work with it instead of against it. His hands covering hers on the stock, his chest pressed against her back for stability. Clara had found it difficult to concentrate on anything but his proximity. But gradually, his calm instruction had taken effect. Her shots began to group closer to the target, and her confidence grew. The breakthrough had come on their 4th day of practice. A young deer had emerged from the tree line. Unaware of their presence in the blind, Silas had constructed overlooking a natural salt lick. Clara had raised the rifle without thinking, settled into her shooting position, and squeezed the trigger in one smooth motion. The deer had dropped cleanly, and Clara had stared in amazement at what she'd accomplished. "I did that," she'd said wonderingly. "I actually did that." "You did," Silas had agreed, and there had been unmistakable pride in his voice. "Clean shot, quick death. Your grandfather would have approved." The comment had puzzled her until she remembered that her grandfather had been a hunter in his youth, before settling down to farming. It was strange to think that she might have inherited some natural aptitude for skills she'd never imagined needing. Dressing the deer had been another education entirely. Silas had explained each step as they worked, showing her how to preserve every usable part of the animal. Nothing was wasted. Meat for food, hide for leather, bones for tools, even the sinew for thread. It was a practical philosophy that extended to every aspect of mountain living. "The wilderness provides everything you need," he'd explained as they worked by lantern light in his small storage shed. "But only if you know how to use what it gives you." That evening, sharing fresh venison by the fire, Clara had reflected on how much she'd changed since arriving at the cabin. Her hands were calloused now from handling ropes and tools. Her body had grown stronger from the constant physical demands of mountain life. Most importantly, her mind had adapted to thinking in terms of practical solutions rather than social conventions. "I keep expecting to feel guilty," she'd confessed to Silas as they prepared for bed. "Taking a life, even an animal's life, should bother someone raised as I was. But it doesn't. No, it feels natural somehow, like something I was always meant to know how to do." He'd studied her face in the firelight, perhaps seeing the same transformation she felt within herself. The wilderness has a way of teaching people who they really are, underneath all the civilizing. The next morning had brought visitors. 2 mountain men leading a small pack train toward the winter trading posts. Jake Thornton, whom Silas had mentioned as his nearest neighbor, proved to be a grizzled man in his 60s with keen blue eyes and a ready smile. His companion, a younger man named Pete Hawkins, had been more reserved, studying Clara with obvious curiosity. "Heard you had company," Jake had said without preamble, settling into the chair Silas offered. "Thought I'd stop by and make sure." Everything was peaceful-like. Clara had understood the coded inquiry. In this remote country, news traveled through an informal network of trappers, hunters, and settlers. Jake was checking to ensure she wasn't here under duress, and that her presence didn't represent trouble for his friend. "Miss Whitmore is an old friend from my childhood," Silas had explained carefully. "She's staying the winter." Jake had nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, but Pete had continued to watch Clara with calculating eyes. When she'd excused herself to tend the fire, she'd overheard his whispered question. "You sure about this, Silas?" Woman like that draws attention, and not all of it friendly. Silas's response had been firm. "She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The declaration had sent warmth through Clara that had nothing to do with the blazing logs. He was claiming her publicly, marking his territory in the subtle way of mountain men. It was both thrilling and sobering. Thrilling because it confirmed his feelings, sobering because it meant he was prepared to fight for her, if necessary. When the men had departed the next morning, they'd carried with them a carefully neutral Message for anyone who might be asking questions about a missing woman. Clara Whitmore was dead as far as the outside world was concerned, lost in the mountains during her flight from an unwanted marriage. In her place was someone new, a woman learning to skin deer and hit targets at 100 yards. Someone who belonged in this harsh country as surely as the pine trees and granite peaks. But that night, alone with Silas by the fire, Clara had finally voiced the fear that haunted her quiet moments. "What happens come spring?" she'd asked. "When the pass is clear and travel becomes possible again?" Silas had been quiet for a long moment, whittling shavings from a piece of birch. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to stay," she'd said simply. "Here with you, but I don't know if that's fair to ask." He'd looked up then, his knife stilling in his hands. And what would people say about a refined lady choosing to live in sin with a mountain hermit? "I don't care what people say anymore." The words had surprised her with their vehemence. "The people whose opinions mattered tried to sell me to the highest bidder. I'm done caring about their approval." Something had shifted in his expression. Hope, perhaps mixed with wonder. "You're sure?" "This life is hard, Clara. Isolated. There are no guarantees except that we'd face it together." "I've never been more sure of anything," she'd replied, and knew it was true. 3 weeks after Jake Thornton's visit, Silas made a decision that would change everything. He'd been studying his collection of maps by lamplight when Clara noticed him tracing a route she hadn't seen before, a winding path that led deeper into the mountains, toward valleys marked only with question marks and notations in an unfamiliar script. "What's that?" she'd asked, leaning over his shoulder to get a better look. "Something I found years ago but never had reason to explore," he'd replied, his finger following the faded ink lines. "Old Native American map, traded from a Crow elder, who said it showed a hidden valley, protected on all sides by cliffs with its own water source and game trails." Clara had studied the cryptic markings, recognizing the significance immediately. A sanctuary, somewhere no one could find us even if they knew where to look. Exactly, but it's a hard journey, especially in winter conditions. And there's no guarantee the place exists as described. The idea had taken root in both their minds over the following days. Their current situation, while comfortable, remained precarious. Blackwood's men would likely return come spring, and other travelers might remember seeing a woman at Silas's cabin. The hidden valley represented something more than safety. It offered the possibility of a truly fresh start, away from all connections to their past lives. The decision crystallized during a particularly brutal blizzard that kept them confined. For 3 days straight, huddled together for warmth, sharing stories and dreams by firelight, Clara had finally spoken the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I love you," she'd said simply, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Not the boy you were, though I treasured him, the man you've become, the life we could have together." His response had been everything she'd hoped. Gentle hands cupping her face, lips that tasted of coffee and promise, whispered words of devotion that made her heart race. They'd made love that night, with the storm raging outside, their joining, both tender and desperate, as if they could seal their commitment through the simple act of choosing each other completely. In the aftermath, wrapped in quilts and watching the fire burn low, Silas had pulled out the ancient map again. "We leave for the hidden valley as soon as the weather clears," he'd said decisively. "Whatever's there, we'll face it together." Preparation for the journey had consumed the next week. They could take only essentials: food, ammunition, basic tools, and the few possessions that held deep meaning. Clara had agonized over what to leave behind, finally settling on her mother's Bible, the wooden bear, and a small sewing kit that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else would remain in the cabin, either for their possible return or for whoever found the place after they were gone. Silas had been more systematic, packing with the efficiency of a man accustomed to traveling light. His father's rifle, naturally, along with traps, fishing line, a hand axe, and medical supplies. He'd also included his carving tools and several blocks of good wood, understanding that the ability to create useful items might mean the difference between comfort and mere survival. The morning of their departure had dawned clear and bitter, cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every breath visible and turned exposed skin raw within minutes. They'd loaded their supplies onto a crude travois that Silas had constructed, reasoning that the horses could pull more weight than they could carry, even through snow. "Last chance to change your mind," Silas had said, as they prepared to leave. "The cabin. Once we're gone, there's no coming back. Not to this place. Not to the people we used to be." Clara had looked around the small space that had become home, memorizing details she might never see again. The rough table where they'd shared so many meals, the hearth where she'd first felt truly safe, the simple bed where they'd discovered each other as lovers. It would be hard to leave, but not as hard as staying would have been. "I'm ready," she'd said, and meant it. The journey to the hidden valley had proven every bit as challenging as Silas had warned. The ancient map, while detailed, couldn't account for changes wrought by decades of weather and geological shifts. Landmarks had vanished beneath avalanches or been obscured by new growth. Trails mentioned in the Crow Elders' notations led to impassable rockfalls or dead ends. For 5 days, they'd traveled deeper into country that grew increasingly wild and remote. They'd seen no signs of human presence, no footprints, no abandoned campsites, no carved blazes on trees. It was as if they'd passed beyond the edge of the known world into something primordial and untouched. The challenges had tested both their physical endurance and their partnership. When Clara's mare had gone lame on the 3rd day, they'd redistributed the loads and continued on foot, taking turns breaking trail through knee-deep snow. When Silas had fallen through thin ice crossing a frozen stream, Clara had built a fire and warmed him back to life with competent efficiency that would have amazed her former self. "You're stronger than you know," he'd told her that night, fever bright from his ordeal but recovering steadily. "Stronger than I ever imagined when you first appeared at my door." "I had a good teacher," she'd replied, but privately she wondered if the strength had always been there, waiting for circumstances that required its emergence. On the 6th day, just when Clara was beginning to fear they'd followed the map into nowhere, they'd found it, a narrow defile between towering cliffs that opened onto a hidden valley exactly as the ancient drawings had promised. Sheltered from wind, with a clear stream running through its center and evidence of abundant wildlife, it was everything they'd hoped for, and more. "It's perfect," Clara had whispered, standing at the valley's mouth and surveying their new kingdom. "It's like paradise." Silas had nodded, already planning where to build their cabin and plant their first garden. But his eyes had held a wariness that spoke of hard-won experience. "Paradise," his expression seemed to say, "was something you had to fight to keep." As if summoned by his caution, they'd discovered that first evening that they weren't the valley's only inhabitants. A family of bears had denned in the caves along the eastern wall, and their fresh tracks crisscrossed the meadow where Silas had envisioned their home. It would be another challenge to overcome, another test of their determination to build a life in this remote sanctuary. But as Clara had fallen asleep in Silas's arms beneath a canopy of stars brighter than any she'd seen in civilization, she'd felt only gratitude. They were together, they were free, and they had found their promised land. Whatever trials lay ahead would be faced as partners, bound by love and tested by survival. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for when she'd fled Millfield in her torn wedding dress, and infinitely more precious because they'd chosen it together. The hidden valley provided 3 weeks of blissful isolation before the past caught up with them in the most unexpected way possible. Clara was tending their small fire on a crisp morning in early March when she heard Silas calling her name with unusual urgency from across the meadow. She found him crouched beside their makeshift shelter, examining something in the snow with intense concentration. As she approached, she could see it was a piece of paper, yellowed and partially damaged by weather, but still legible. "Where did you find that?" she asked, settling beside him. Tucked inside a cairn of rocks near the stream. Someone left it there deliberately. His voice carried a strange tension as he handed her the document. You need to read this, Clara, all of it. The paper was a legal document, written in the formal language of territorial law, but what she read made her blood run cold. It was a deed transfer, dated 3 years earlier, transferring ownership of vast tracts of land throughout Millfield Valley from various private owners to one Cornelius Blackwood. But it wasn't the business transaction itself that stunned her. It was the method by which the transfers had been accomplished. According to the document, each property had been seized for unpaid taxes, with the tax assessments being conducted by Territorial Assessor J. Mitchell Whitmore. Her father's signature appeared at the bottom of the page, along with an official seal she recognized from his office. This can't be right, she whispered, reading through the names of displaced families, the Johnsons, the Petersons, the McKinneys. Good people who had farmed the valley for generations, all dispossessed according to this document by her own father's assessments. But there was more. A second page detailed a contract between Blackwood and her father, outlining a systematic plan to acquire properties throughout the valley using inflated tax assessments and legal maneuvering. In return for his cooperation, J. Mitchell Whitmore would receive a percentage of the profits from Blackwood's subsequent development of the acquired lands. I don't understand, Clara said, her hands shaking as she held the damning evidence. Papa would never have done this. He was an honest man, respected by everyone in the valley. Silas studied her face with gentle sympathy. People do desperate things when they're backed into a corner, Clara. Maybe Blackwood had some hold over him, debts, threats, something that made him feel like he had no choice. A third page provided the answer with devastating clarity. It was a promissory note in her father's handwriting, acknowledging a debt of $5,000 to Blackwood for gambling losses incurred at private games. The date was 2 years before her father's death, and the terms were brutal. If the debt wasn't repaid within 1 year, Blackwood would claim the Whitmore farm and all its assets. He was gambling, Clara said numbly. All those nights, he said. He was working late at the office, all those business trips to the territorial capital. He was gambling and losing money we didn't have. The final piece of the puzzle was a letter in her father's familiar script, addressed to Cornelius Blackwood, and dated just weeks before his death. Cornelius, I can no longer continue with our arrangement. The guilt of what we've done to our neighbors weighs too heavily on my conscience. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions and make public confession of our fraud. My daughter deserves better than to inherit a legacy built on the suffering of others. Do what you will to me, but leave Clara out of this. She's innocent of any wrongdoing. J. Mitchell Whitmore. Clara read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision as the full scope of her father's betrayal and redemption became clear. He was going to confess, she said finally. He was going to expose the whole scheme, and died before he could, Silas observed quietly. That illness that took him so quickly, you said the doctor couldn't identify the cause. The implication hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered to prevent his confession, and she'd been too. Naive to recognize the signs. Blackwood's insistence on marrying her, his claim to be settling her father's debts out of generosity. It had all been calculated to keep her under his control and prevent any investigation into their illegal activities. I'm not just a runaway bride, she said, understanding flooding through her. I'm a witness to murder and fraud on a massive scale, and you have the evidence to prove it. Silas gestured to the documents. Someone hid these papers here for a reason, probably your father, knowing that Blackwood might try to destroy any proof of their partnership. Clara's mind raced as she considered the implications. But who would believe me? Blackwood owns the judge, the sheriff, probably half the territorial government, and I'm a woman who fled from a legitimate marriage. My word against his wouldn't carry much weight. Maybe not in Millfield, Silas agreed, but territorial jurisdiction is bigger than one corrupt valley. There are federal marshals, territorial governors, people who answer to authorities in Washington rather than local influence. She looked around their peaceful valley, realizing with a sinking heart that their sanctuary had just become a temporary refuge. We can't stay here, can we? Not with this knowledge. We could, Silas said carefully. We could burn these papers and live out our lives pretending we never found them. Blackwood would eventually assume you died in the mountains and you'd be free to start over as someone else entirely. It was tempting, so tempting that Clara almost reached for the documents to consign them to the flames. She'd found happiness here with Silas, discovered parts of herself she'd never known existed. Why should she sacrifice that for the sake of justice for people who might not even thank her for the effort? But then she remembered the families named in the tax assessments, neighbors who had invited her to their homes, who had celebrated her childhood achievements and mourned with her family during difficult times. They'd lost everything because of her father's weakness and Blackwood's greed, and many had probably died in poverty as a result. I can't, she said finally. I can't live with this knowledge and do nothing. Those people deserve justice, and my father deserves to have his final attempt at redemption honored. Silas nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Then we need to get these documents to someone who can act on them, someone beyond Blackwood's influence. Fort Collins has a federal marshal, Clara said, remembering conversations from her father's office. Marshal Thomas Brennan. Papa mentioned him once as being scrupulously honest, immune to corruption. Fort Collins is a week's hard ride from here, longer if the weather turns bad. Silas was already calculating distances and routes, and Blackwood will have men watching the roads, especially if he suspects you're still alive. Then we'll have to be smarter than his men, Clara said, surprised by the determination in her own voice. We'll use the back trails, travel at night when necessary, avoid any place his people might be watching. As they spent the rest of the day planning their dangerous journey, Clara found herself reflecting on how completely her understanding of her past had been overturned. The father she'd mourned as a victim of Blackwood's schemes had been a willing participant in the destruction of their community. Her comfortable childhood had been built on the suffering of their neighbors. Even her own near marriage to Blackwood took on new meaning. Not just an escape from an unwanted husband, but a flight from complicity in ongoing crimes. Yet paradoxically, the revelations had also freed her from the last chains binding her to her former life. She owed nothing to her father's memory beyond ensuring his final letter saw the light of day. She owed nothing to the society that had been willing to sell her to maintain its corruption. Her only obligations now were to justice and to the man who had chosen to stand beside her despite the dangers that choice entailed. That evening, as they prepared to leave their valley paradise, Clara carefully wrapped the legal documents in oiled cloth and secured them in her saddlebags. They represented evidence that could destroy Blackwood and restore stolen property to dozens of families, but only if she lived long enough to present them to proper authorities. "Are you ready for this?" Silas asked as they banked their fire for the last time. "Once we ride out of here, there's no going back to the simple life we've built." Clara looked around the valley that had briefly been home, memorizing the peace they were about to abandon. "I'm ready," she said, and discovered that she meant it. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight meant losing everything else. The journey to Fort Collins proved more treacherous than either Clara or Silas had anticipated. Spring thaw had begun in earnest, turning mountain trails into rivers of mud and making river crossings unpredictable and dangerous. What should have been a week's travel stretched into 2 weeks of careful navigation around washouts, detours through unmarked territory, and constant vigilance for signs of pursuit. On the third day out from their valley, they'd spotted smoke from a campfire in the distance and had spent precious hours circling wide to avoid potential contact. Through Silas's spyglass, they'd glimpsed 3 riders in dark coats, too well equipped and purposeful to be casual travelers. Blackwood's men were indeed searching, casting a wide net through the mountain country. They're being systematic. Silas had observed as they watched the distant riders from concealment, working a grid pattern, checking every cabin and settlement between here and the main roads. Someone's paying them well to be thorough. Clara had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How could they know we're heading to Fort Collins? We never told anyone our destination. They don't need to know our specific destination, Silas had replied grimly. They just need to cover all the places where someone might take evidence. To federal authorities, Fort Collins, Denver, Colorado Springs, anywhere there's a territorial marshal or federal judge. The realization that their enemies could predict their movements had forced them to reconsider their entire approach. Instead of making directly for Fort Collins, they'd begun a series of deceptive maneuvers, sometimes doubling back on their own trail, sometimes splitting up briefly to create confusion about their numbers and direction. The psychological strain of constant alertness began to wear on both of them. Clara found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, while Silas grew increasingly quiet and focused, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. Their conversations became brief and practical, focused on immediate survival needs rather than the deeper discussions that had sustained them through the winter months. But the physical challenges proved equally daunting. Clara's mare developed a persistent limp that forced them to rest frequently, and their food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated due to the extended travel time. Twice they'd been forced to hunt for meat, using precious time they could ill afford, and risking the sound of gunshots that might attract unwanted attention. The breaking point came on their 10th day of travel, when they crested a ridge and saw Fort Collins spread out in the valley below, so close they could make out individual buildings, yet still a full day's ride away across terrain that offered little concealment. Worse, smoke from multiple campfires dotted the valley approaches, suggesting that their enemies had indeed anticipated their destination and positioned men to intercept them. They're not even trying to hide their presence, Clara observed, studying the obvious surveillance positions through Silas's spyglass. They want us to know we're trapped. Silas had been quiet for a long moment, calculating odds and alternatives. With the methodical patience she'd come to associate with his military experience. There's another way, he'd said finally. Risky, but it might be our only chance. He'd explained his plan as they made camp that evening in a hidden drawer that offered protection from observation. Instead of trying to reach Marshal Brennan directly, they would approach a different federal official, Judge Harrison McCullough, who held court in Fort Collins but maintained a private residence on the outskirts of town. McCullough was known for his integrity and his willingness to hear cases that other officials might prefer to avoid. The judge's house sits on a hill overlooking the town, Silas had explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. There's an old mining trail that leads up the back slope, probably not watched because it's so steep and treacherous. If we can reach him privately, present our evidence before Blackwood's people realize what we're doing, he might be able to provide protection while the case is investigated. Clara had studied the rough map, recognizing both the cleverness of the plan and its inherent dangers. And if we're wrong about Judge McCullough? If he's been corrupted like the others? Then we'll likely be dead by dawn, Silas had replied, with characteristic bluntness, but doing nothing guarantees we'll never see justice done. They'd spent their final night before the attempt in careful preparation, checking weapons, reviewing the route, and organizing the precious documents that represented their only leverage. Clara had also taken time to write a letter detailing everything they'd discovered, creating a backup record in case they didn't survive to present the evidence personally. If something happens to us, she'd told Silas as she sealed the letter, Jake Thornton might be willing to see this reaches. Someone in authority. He struck me as a man who values justice. Nothing's going to happen, Silas had replied, but she'd noticed him checking his rifle one more time and counting his ammunition with unusual care. They'd made love that night with desperate intensity, both aware that it might be their last time together. In the morning, they would risk everything on a single gamble: their lives, their future, and the hopes of dozens of families who didn't even know someone was fighting for their stolen property. As dawn approached, Clara had lain awake in Silas's arms, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a sheltered young woman whose greatest concern was choosing appropriate dress for social occasions. Now she was prepared to face armed men and corrupt officials in pursuit of justice for people she barely remembered. The transformation still amazed her. Not just the practical skills she'd acquired, riding, shooting, surviving in wilderness conditions, but the fundamental change in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She was no longer someone who waited for others to solve her problems or accepted injustice as the natural order of things. She had become someone who took action, who fought for what was right, regardless of personal cost. "Are you ready?" Silas had whispered as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. "I'm ready," she'd replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They'd approached the mining trail in the pre-dawn darkness, leading their horses through terrain so steep and rocky that footing was treacherous even in daylight. The old path had been carved by miners desperate to reach silver claims higher in the mountains, and it showed: narrow switchbacks carved into cliffsides, loose rock that shifted underfoot, gaps where winter avalanches had swept away entire sections of the trail, but the route's very difficulty proved to be their protection. No one expected two people to attempt such a dangerous approach, especially when easier paths were available. They saw no signs of surveillance or pursuit as they climbed steadily toward the judge's hilltop residence. The house, when they finally reached it, proved to be a substantial log structure with commanding views of the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that Judge McCullough was in residence, but they observed the building carefully for several minutes before approaching, watching for any signs that it might be under surveillance. "Now or never," Silas had murmured as they prepared to leave their concealment. "If this goes wrong, don't try to save me. Take the evidence and run. We go together or not at all," Clara had replied firmly. "I won't abandon you now." His smile had been proud and sad at the same time. "I love you for saying that, but—" "No," she'd cut him off with surprising vehemence. "We've come too far together to separate now. Whatever happens, we face it as partners." They'd approached the house openly, making no attempt at concealment once they'd committed to the plan. Clara carried the oiled packet of legal documents, while Silas kept his rifle ready, but not obviously threatening. If Judge McCullough proved, to be honest, they would need to appear as legitimate petitioners seeking justice. If he proved corrupt, they would need every advantage they could muster. The man who answered their knock was tall and dignified, with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes that missed nothing as he assessed his unexpected visitors. "Judge McCullough?" Clara had asked politely. "I am, and you are?" "Clara Whitmore and Silas McGraw. We have evidence of fraud and murder that requires federal intervention. Would you be willing to examine our documentation?" The judge had studied them for a long moment, taking in their travel-stained clothes, obvious exhaustion, and the careful way Silas positioned himself to cover potential approaches to the house. "You're the woman everyone's been searching for," he'd said finally. "The runaway bride who disappeared into the mountains." "I am," Clara had replied simply, "and I have evidence that explains why certain people were so eager to prevent my escape." Judge McCullough had stepped aside to let them enter, but Clara could see calculation in his eyes. The next few minutes would determine whether they'd found salvation or walked into a trap of their own making. Judge Harrison McCullough's study was a testament to learning and justice, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes of territorial law and federal statutes. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface organized with the meticulous care of a man accustomed to weighing evidence and rendering verdicts that could change lives forever. Clara sat rigidly in the chair he'd offered, the packet of documents clutched in her hands, while Silas positioned himself near the window where he could watch for approaching riders. The judge had listened without interruption as she'd recounted her story, his expression growing increasingly grave as she'd described her father's complicity in Blackwood's schemes and her suspicions about the circumstances of his death. "These are serious allegations, Miss Whitmore," McCullough had said when she'd finished. "Fraud, conspiracy, possibly murder. If proven, they would result in significant federal charges." "I understand the gravity of what I'm claiming," Clara had replied, extending the packet toward him, "but I believe these documents provide the proof you'll need." The judge had accepted the papers with careful hands, spreading them across his desk in precise order. Clara had watched his face as he'd read, noting the way his eyebrows had risen at certain passages, the sharp intake of breath when he'd encountered her father's final letter, the slow shake of his head as the full scope of the conspiracy had become clear. "Remarkable," he'd murmured finally. "If these documents are authentic, and preliminary examination suggests they are, Mr. Blackwood and his associates have perpetrated one of the most extensive land frauds in territorial history. Then you'll act on this evidence?" Clara had asked, hope rising in her chest. "I'll certainly investigate," McCullough had replied carefully. "But you must understand, bringing charges against a man of Blackwood's influence will require more than documents hidden in a mountain valley. I'll need corroborating evidence, witness testimony, financial records that support these claims." Silas had turned from his position at the window, his expression alert. "Judge, we've got company. 3 riders approaching from the main road, moving fast." McCullough had risen immediately, moving to peer through the curtains. Blackwood's men eyed. "Wager!" Word travels fast in a small community when strangers arrive asking about federal jurisdiction. "What do we do?" Clara had asked, her earlier confidence evaporating as the reality of their situation became clear. "You stay calm and let me handle this," the judge had replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. "Mr. McGraw, I suggest you keep that rifle ready but out of sight. Miss Whitmore, gather those documents. We may need to secure them quickly." The sound of hoofbeats had grown louder, followed by heavy footsteps on the front porch. When the knock came, it was demanding rather than respectful, the kind of summons that expected immediate compliance. McCullough had opened the door to reveal 3 men in dark coats, their faces hard with the kind of professional violence that money could buy. The leader was a tall man with dead eyes and a carefully groomed mustache, who identified himself as Marcus Thorne, Blackwood's chief enforcer. "Judge McCullough," Thorne had said with false courtesy, "we're looking for a dangerous fugitive, a woman who's been spreading lies about respectable citizens. We have reason to believe she might have imposed upon your hospitality." "I'm not in the habit of harboring fugitives, Mr. Thorne," McCullough had replied evenly. "What specific crimes is this woman alleged to have committed?" "Theft, fraud, adultery." Thorne had rattled off the charges with practiced ease. "She stole valuable documents from her lawful husband's property and has been living in sin with a known criminal. We have warrants for both their arrests." Clara had felt ice form in her stomach as she'd recognized the efficiency of Blackwood's response. By characterizing her as a thief and adulteress, he'd undermined any credibility she might have as a witness. By claiming the documents were stolen property, he'd created legal grounds to seize them before they could be examined by federal authorities. "I'll need to see those warrants," McCullough had said, extending his hand. Thorne had produced a roll of papers with obvious satisfaction. "Signed by Judge Whitman in Millfield with territorial authority. I'm afraid we'll need to search your premises, Judge, for everyone's safety." As Thorne's men had begun to spread out through the house, Clara had caught Silas's eye and seen her. own desperation reflected there. They'd come so close to achieving justice, only to be outmaneuvered by Blackwood's superior resources and legal connections. But Judge McCullough had surprised them all by stepping forward with unexpected firmness. "I'm afraid I can't allow that, Mr. Thorne. This residence falls under federal jurisdiction as the home of a territorial judge. Any search would require federal warrants, not local ones. The confrontation that followed would determine everything, whether justice would prevail or whether Blackwood's corruption would prove too powerful to overcome." As Thorne's hand had moved toward his pistol, Clara had realized that their fate now depended entirely on whether one honest judge could stand against the forces arrayed against them. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was nowhere left to run. The tension in Judge McCullough's study was palpable as Marcus Thorne's hand hovered near his pistol, his two companions flanking him with practiced ease. Clara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the precious documents that represented the only hope of justice for her father's victims. "Federal jurisdiction or not," Thorne said with cold menace, "we have legal authority to apprehend wanted criminals. Stand aside, Judge, and no one needs to get hurt." But McCullough had faced down dangerous men before in his years on the territorial bench. "Mr. Thorne, I suggest you reconsider your position. These premises are protected by federal law, and any violence committed here would constitute a federal crime. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" For a moment the standoff held, then Silas stepped into view, his rifle held with deceptive casualness, but clearly ready for use. "The judge asked you politely to leave," he said quietly. "I'd suggest you listen." Thorne's eyes narrowed as he assessed this new threat. "One man against three, mountain man. Poor odds for heroics." "Maybe," Silas replied with a slight smile. "But the first shot's mine, and I don't usually miss at this range. Question is whether you're willing to die for Blackwood's money." The calculation was clear in Thorne's eyes. Success wasn't worth the risk if it meant certain death. But before he could respond, the sound of additional horses approaching from outside changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "That'll be Marshal Brennan," Judge McCullough announced with satisfaction. "I took the liberty of sending word to him when I saw you approaching. Federal marshals take a dim view of armed men threatening territorial judges." Thorne's confidence faltered as the implications became clear. What had seemed like a simple matter of retrieving stolen property and fugitives had suddenly become a federal incident involving multiple law enforcement jurisdictions. Marshal Thomas Brennan proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of enforcing federal law in hostile territory. He entered the study with his deputy, taking in the tense scene with experienced eyes. "Judge McCullough," he said with professional courtesy, "your message mentioned urgent federal business?" "Indeed, Marshal. Miss Whitmore here has presented evidence of extensive fraud and possible murder involving territorial land transactions. Mr. Thorne and his associates were attempting to prevent federal examination of that evidence." Brennan's gaze shifted to Thorne, who was now visibly reconsidering his aggressive stance. "Is that so? Mr. Thorne, I'll need to see those warrants you mentioned." Thorne produced the papers with obvious reluctance, knowing they would be scrutinized. With greater care than he'd anticipated, Brennan examined them methodically, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "These warrants are irregularly issued," he announced finally. "Judge Whitman exceeded his jurisdiction in several areas, and the charges listed don't correspond to territorial statutes. I'm afraid these documents have no legal standing in federal territory." Clara felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. The trap Blackwood had set was crumbling under proper legal scrutiny. "Furthermore," Brennan continued, "the manner of your approach to this residence suggests intent to commit federal crimes. I'm placing all three of you under arrest pending investigation." Thorne's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. We're acting on behalf of Cornelius Blackwood, a respected businessman who's simply trying to recover stolen property and apprehend his lawful wife." His wife? Judge McCullough interjected sharply. Miss Whitmore, were marriage vows actually completed before you fled? No, Clara replied firmly. I refused to speak the vows and fled before the ceremony could be concluded. I am not, nor have I ever been, Mrs. Blackwood. The legal implications were immediate and devastating to Blackwood's position. Without a completed marriage, he had no legal claim to Clara or her property. His pursuit of her became harassment rather than legitimate spousal authority, and his claims of theft became fraudulent attempts to seize property that wasn't his. Marshal, Clara said, finding her voice stronger now, I have documented evidence that Mr. Blackwood murdered my father to prevent exposure of their fraudulent land scheme. These papers detail systematic theft from dozens of families throughout Millfield Valley. She handed the precious documents to Brennan, who examined them with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to complex criminal cases. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the scope of the conspiracy. Judge McCullough, he said, finally, I believe we have sufficient grounds for federal charges against Mr. Blackwood and his associates. I'll need to take Miss Whitmore and Mr. McGraw into protective custody while we investigate these claims. It was protection disguised as arrest, a legal maneuver that would keep them safe while the federal authorities built their case against Blackwood. Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she realized that their desperate gamble had succeeded. Thorne made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Blackwood won't stand for this interference. He has influential friends throughout the territory. Then those friends can explain their associations to a federal grand jury, Brennan replied coolly. Deputy Morrison, please escort these gentlemen to our holding facility. I'll want to question them extensively about their employer's activities. As Thorne and his companions were led away in shackles, Clara finally allowed herself to believe that justice might actually be possible. The evidence was in federal hands, Blackwood's men were in custody, and she and Silas were under the protection of honest law enforcement. But even as relief washed over her, she understood that this was only the beginning. Blackwood would not surrender easily, and the legal battle ahead would test everything they had fought to achieve. Still, for the first time since fleeing her wedding, Clara felt genuinely hopeful about the future. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of the small church in Fort Collins, her hand resting on Silas's arm as they prepared to enter together. The simple gold wedding rings they wore, crafted by the local blacksmith from metal they'd chosen together, caught the morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The legal proceedings against Cornelius Blackwood had concluded 3 weeks earlier with his conviction on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The evidence Clara and Silas had risked everything to preserve had proven decisive, particularly when corroborated by testimony from other victims who'd finally found the courage to speak against their oppressor. Blackwood himself had fled the territory during the investigation, but not before Marshal Brennan had frozen his assets and begun the process of restoring stolen properties to their rightful owners. The Whitmore farm, along with dozens of other parcels throughout Millfield Valley, were being returned to the families who'd lost them, or to their surviving relatives in cases where the original owners had died in poverty after their dispossession. You ready for this? Silas asked quietly, straightening the simple black suit he'd purchased for the occasion. It was the first formal clothing he'd worn in years, and Clara could see the discomfort in his posture, despite his obvious effort to look presentable. More than ready, she replied, smoothing the blue dress she'd chosen for their wedding. It was practical rather than elaborate, wool rather than silk, designed for a frontier life rather than drawing-room elegance. But it suited the woman she'd become, and more importantly, it suited the life they were planning together. The ceremony itself was beautifully simple. Judge McCullough, who had become a trusted friend during the months of legal proceedings, performed the service with dignified warmth. Jake Thornton had ridden down from the mountains to serve as Silas's witness, bringing with him a hand-carved, wooden box as a wedding gift. A few other friends they'd made in Fort Collins completed the small gathering, people who'd come to know them during their extended stay in town while the legal case unfolded. As they exchanged vows, Clara found herself thinking of how different this moment was from the nightmare wedding she'd fled 6 months earlier. There was no coercion here, no legal documents binding her to a man who saw her as property. Instead, there was choice, mutual, freely given, and witnessed by people who respected both her independence and their partnership. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges come," she said when her moment came to speak the vows they'd written together. "To be your partner in building the life we both choose, and to love you not just for who you are, but for who we become together." Silas's vows were characteristically direct, but deeply felt. "I promise to protect what we build together without trying to cage your spirit, to share both the hard work and the joy of the life we're making, and to love you as my equal and my choice, today and all our days to come." When Judge McCullough pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by autumn sunlight streaming through the church windows and the approving smiles of friends who understood what they'd overcome to reach this moment. The reception, held in the church's simple social hall, was a reflection of the community they'd found in Fort Collins. Honest, practical people who valued substance over appearance. The food was hearty rather than elegant, the music provided by a local fiddler, the decorations simple wildflowers that Clara had gathered herself from the meadows outside town. During the dancing, Jake Thornton had pulled Clara aside with uncharacteristic solemnity. "You know Silas was pretty much dead inside when I first met him," he'd said, watching her new husband attempt to navigate an unfamiliar waltz. "Whatever darkness he carried from his past had just about consumed him. You brought him back to life, girl. That's a gift worth more than all the gold in those mountains." Clara had watched Silas across the room, seeing him laugh at something one of their guests had said, and marveled at the truth of Jake's observation. The lonely, wounded man who'd opened his cabin door to her had been transformed by their shared trials into someone capable of deep joy and partnership. Just as she'd been transformed from a sheltered, passive young woman into someone capable of facing danger and fighting for justice. Their honeymoon had been a return to the hidden valley that had briefly been their paradise. They'd spent 2 weeks there rebuilding the shelter, planning improvements, and simply enjoying the peace of their sanctuary. It would serve as their retreat when the demands of more civilized life became too pressing, but they'd both agreed that their primary residence would be closer to the community they'd found in Fort Collins. Silas had accepted a position as a federal deputy marshal, his wilderness skills and knowledge of the mountain country proving invaluable for law enforcement in the rough territory. Clara had established a small practice, helping other women navigate legal challenges, divorce proceedings, property disputes, and custody battles that required someone who understood both the law and the unique pressures faced by women in frontier society. Together, they'd purchased a modest house on the outskirts of Fort Collins, with enough land for a garden and room for the horses that remained essential to their way of life. It was a compromise between Silas's need for open space and Clara's desire to remain connected to the community that had offered them refuge and justice. On quiet evenings, they often sat on their front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered them during their courtship. Silas would work on his carving. He'd developed a reputation for the small wooden animals that found their way to children throughout the territory, while Clara read or worked on correspondence with the families who'd benefited from the restoration of their stolen lands. The wooden bear that had brought them together sat in a place of honor on their mantelpiece, a reminder of the childhood connection that had grown into mature love. Beside it sat a small carving Silas had made recently, 2 figures standing together against a mountain backdrop, facing whatever challenges might come with quiet confidence and shared strength. It was, Clara reflected, exactly the life she would have chosen, if she'd been wise enough to imagine it, a life built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. She'd traded a refined existence of quiet desperation for a frontier, life of meaningful work and genuine partnership. It was, she decided, the best bargain she'd ever made.